I'm John Heilemann, and this is the Hell and High Water Podcast. My guest today is documentarian extraordinaire Ken Burns.
I'm Ken Burns, and the state of our union is in deep trouble. We're in the middle of the fourth great crisis in the United States after the Civil War, the Depression, and World War II, beset by three different viruses. A 2-year-old novel coronavirus, a 402-year-old virus of white supremacy and racial injustice, and an age-old human virus of lying, misinformation, conspiracy, and paranoia.
One day in October of 1954, 12-year-old Cassius rode his bicycle into downtown Louisville. It began to rain, and the boys took cover in the Columbia Auditorium. They emerged to find that the bicycle was gone.
He went down, and the cop in the basement was this Joe Martin, who was running a little boxing school.
The sight of this boxing gym, the smell of the leather and the sweat, and the excitement, the action of boys in a ring hitting each other, black and white together.
And he, reported the crime, and I'm going to get the guy, and I'm going to, kill him. Joe Martin said, well, do you know how to fight? Fight. And that was the beginning.
And that is the beginning of Ken Burns' new, magnificent, I will say, series on Muhammad Ali, called Muhammad Ali. Ken, it's great to have you here on Hell and High Water. I have been wanting to do an interview with you about some project of yours for, it feels like years, and finally I was able to hook you to get on this thing with me, so I appreciate it, and we're going to have a great conversation today because I love this series. I love it.
Thank you. And I have to say right off the bat, it is co-directed by Sarah Burns.
Yep.
And her husband, David McMahon. We've collaborated on the Central Park Five. Yep. And Jackie Robinson, they also happen to be the writers of this, who wrote those words, and she also happens to be my oldest daughter.
There have been great movies and docs about Ali. I mean, When We Were Kings is one of my favorite documentaries ever made. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. Truly one of the great documentaries ever made, feature length, about the Rumble in the Jungle. So why Ali for you? Why Muhammad Ali? What was it that made you say it's time for Ken Burns to turn his attention to this topic?
We know it's Jonathan's fault in a way. We'd worked with him and another producing team on our history of Prohibition, and then we're about to work with him on Jackie Robinson, and he was deep into the Ali biography and said, boy, you should think about him. He said to Sarah and Dave, and they said yes in a nanosecond. Came to me and I said yes in a nanosecond. Justifying doing Ali is so interesting. It's so obvious. This is a man who intersects with all of the important themes of the last half of the 20th century. This is the role of sports in society, the role of the black athlete, ideas of black masculinity and black manhood, about the variety of the civil rights movement, which we tend to put into one narrow box, just like we tend to think that all black people think alike, and they do not. This is about race, of course, the age-old American original sin, as historians say. It's about politics, about war, it's about faith, it's about religion, it's about sex. I mean, everything that we're dealing with now, Muhammad Ali touched. And so what you have a story of freedom and courage and love that is just unsurpassed.
So we saw Ali when he was both, when he was in his prime and when he was in his decline.
Yeah.
But as you look at the whole thing, from the early years through the post-ban, after he was banished from the sport for a period of time when he came back in the early 70s, throughout all of that, the word that comes to me always when I watch him in all of that time is just beauty.
Beauty.
I mean, he is just a fucking beautiful man. He is just, you look at him and think, I've never seen anything like this. Someone who is this beautiful, who moves the way he moves. He is art and poetry in a human form. And even if you hate the violence of boxing, you can't not be kind of flabbergasted by what a gorgeous creature the man was.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm almost moved to tears. I find myself now in the bittersweet moment of having to leave him to you. Now he's yours. Our film is done. Yes, he's so beautiful, and he's saying I'm beautiful. I'm pretty as a girl, he says. But he's always been, I made a film about Jack Johnson who was only for Jack Johnson. Same kind of style, right. Same kind of problems with the government, same times of provocative stuff, bringing out the worst racism in other people, and sometimes yourself in this case. But Ali's for everybody else. So he's empowering in that beauty. And I think that if Michelangelo were around, he'd look at David, he goes, well, maybe not David, maybe I'll do Muhammad Ali. He is just a beautiful, beautiful specimen of a human being. And it is it's something that it is so interesting to talk about, because he had a kind of a sense of who he was from the very beginning, and a sense of purpose. And we all know the origin story: his bike stolen, he's going to go down and he trying to find a cop, and the cop is teaching kids, black and white, how to box, and he's, becomes a boxer, and it's wonderful and it's convenient. But I had a sense even before then that he knew he was destined for something else.
Yes.
And that it makes him a kind of avatar or an apostle, whatever you want to say, of love. That's the complicated thing to talk about. And part of that is just, as you say, it's the physical beauty of this person,
Right.
which makes the physical journey painful, because you hurt if you identify in any way.
Yeah.
You hurt when he hurts.
He's obviously a secular saint now. Everybody, it's the least controversial thing in America to say, God, I love Muhammad Ali.
Right.
When in truth, for a large part of the time when he was at his greatest, he was despised, not just hated, but signified so much that many, mostly white, but not only white,
Not only white. No, no, no.
Americans who looked at him and said, "Shut the fuck up, you arrogant asshole." People rooted for Patterson to beat him. They rooted for
Yeah.
Frazier to beat him. They rooted for everybody to beat him. He was one of the great villains in a lot of people's minds in this period of time. And the transformation of it, I just want you to talk about what you think were the things that turned the key. Was it the athletic accomplishments, being right about Vietnam? What were the things that made Ali go from villain to unequivocal hero?
First of all, I think what you said earlier, he just was who he was. And there's something about authenticity in whatever form that will out. He's just resolutely himself all the time. So in many ways, what you're asking is a question not of him,
But of us.
but of us. We changed. So I think that in many ways, yes, I believe that he's right on Vietnam. He also handles the Frazier thing really well. He's been horrific in his treatment of Joe Frazier,
Yeah.
but when he loses, he knows he's behind on points. He tries to get ahead in the last round, and in his effort, he exposes himself. Frazier knocks him down. He's up right away, finishes out the fight, and then afterwards says, look, I'm responsible for reminding people that failure happens, that you lose a job, you lose a loved one, you lose a title, and we have to figure out this is what life is. And so all of a sudden he's speaking, and Robert Lipsyte, who's a cub reporter at the beginning and follows him all the way through, as Dave Kindred and Jerry Eisenberg are in this film, says this wonderful thing, Frazier wins the fight, but Ali wins America. And so when he lights the torch 25 years ago with the shaking hands, only the most unreconstructed of our brethren can hold a grudge. But it means he hasn't done anything different.
Right.
He's still the same person. I mean, there are a lot of people who want to turn this into a dialectic. Oh, when he could no longer talk, then he's safe. I don't buy into that. I think that we changed. I think we grew just a little bit, which is an improbable thing to say about Americans.
When I watch him, that first Frazier fight, obviously a classic fight. But for me, it's still, maybe because I'm such a fan of When We Were Kings, the Rumble in the Jungle to me is everything. And partly it's everything because it's so deeply connected to so many important political things.
Yes.
But also, he's a deeply religious man who was a lifelong first adherent to the Nation of Islam, a lifelong adherent to Muslimism. He puts his principle, as you just described, it's at the core of his decision to risk everything and refuse to go and fight in the Vietnam War. But this deeply religious man was one of the most egregious philanderers you could imagine. And your series points it out. He's constantly fucking around behind his various wives' backs. He's having children out of wedlock. We still probably don't know how many children of Muhammad Ali there are out there in the world at this date. His mockery of Frazier is racist to its core. He is perfectly willing to call other fighters Uncle Toms in his service. His mockery, I would say, of Foreman is often racist.
Very much so.
How do you get your head around that? Around these profound, I would say, these are not small contradictions, Ken. These are deep contradictions in the man's character.
Todd Boyd, the scholar from USC, referring to the treatment of Frazier, said that this is the language that a white racist would use to describe a black man. And then he pauses and he said, I just think in this case, he used his powers for evil and not for good. And then I realized, oh, I get it. This is a superhero, right? Forget about Marvel. This is a superhero in every sense of the word. And the presumption is that we have perfection when we don't. His flaws are as large as the rest of his life is large. And so it comes down to us to interpret this and to learn and to be inspired. But of course, we can't sweep it under the rugs. They are inherent contradictions that aren't going to be resolved with anything pretty that I say right now. I can't come up with a rap or a rhyme to do it. He cheated on his wives. He had children out of wedlock. He treated Joe Frazier abysmally. He followed the dictates of Elijah Muhammad and cut off his friend and mentor Malcolm X just before Malcolm X's murder. All of which he tried to atone for at the end of his life. But these are real things, and I just think it's what you take. This is the story that we have. And so if we need to cancel out Muhammad Ali because of this strike or that strike, then we've lost the possibility for us to grow and learn and develop from these things. So for us as filmmakers, you just say, this is what it is. And you can be, even the loving opening scene of him stealing cornflakes from his daughter Miriam is offset by hearing later from Kalila, his second wife, that, he was good for about 20 minutes with the kids.
Right.
And those of us who have kids, who've changed diapers, who've stayed up all night, who've walked, who've sung, who've done all those things, that's not good either.
No.
But this is one of the greatest human beings I've ever met. I'm just interested in telling a good story, and hopefully that it's told in a way that invites lots of people to the table. I'm curious. I guess I'm curious about how my country ticks, and I've been making, I think, the same film over and over again, asking who are we, who are these strange and complicated people who call themselves Americans, and each film, of course, never answers the question, deepens it with each inquiry, and I'm just passionately concerned about why we are who we are and the kind of instructive conversation the present can have with the past and how medicinal that can be in certain circumstances.
So a conversation between the present and the past, very a lovely image and descriptive and informative. I just read that very long filmography, and I ask you two simple questions that are not going to have simple answers. One, how did you set on this journey? What was it that got you interested in becoming a documentarian, number one? And when you started, did you have any imagining of that this was the career? I don't mean did you anticipate all of it? What I mean is, was this sort of the journey you thought you were in your idealized fantasy vision of what your career would be like? Is this sort of basically your career has been your dreams come true? I feel like it probably is.
I wish. 42 years ago, last month, I moved from New York City, where I had just finished a good deal of the filming on this film I'd spent years trying to raise the money for on the Brooklyn Bridge, and it was about 75% shot, and I needed a real job. My rent was growing up in Chelsea, and I moved to this house in New Hampshire, where I live now, same bedroom, same bed. Because I thought becoming a documentary filmmaker that seemed to be interested in history was taking a vow of anonymity and poverty. I'm the son of an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist who is an amateur still photographer. My first memory of him building a darkroom in our basement in Newark, Delaware, where he was the only anthropologist in the state of Delaware. My mother developed cancer and spent 10 years dying, and she died after we moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he was one of 40 anthropologists. Afterwards, it was a searing. It's the number one event of my life, the loss of my mother. And afterwards, my father let me stay up late and watch movies with him on TV or out at the movies, and got a real education. And I watched my dad cry for the first time, not at her sickness, not at her death, not at her funeral. And the second I saw him cry, I realized what a safe haven film would be. If you told me that 40 years later I'd still be making historical films in American history, I'd say, get out of here. No, I'm going to do a feature film. I'm going to do experimental cinema verite. But that's what it is. I found what I was supposed to be doing and found a way of speaking. And most importantly, I think found PBS, which was willing to wait. I mean, it has one foot tentatively in the marketplace and the other proudly out. And so, people say, you're always fundraising. Why don't you go to a streaming service or a premium cable? And I could go to them and say, look, I need, $30 million to do Vietnam, and they'd give it to me with my track record. But they wouldn't give me 10 and a half years to do it. And PBS permitted me that time, and I could do a deep dive in Vietnam and do a deep dive in Hemingway or any of the ones that you mentioned on that list.
Right.
And so it's just a kind of exploration. I mean, it's fortunate. I chose history the way, I'm a storyteller, I'm a filmmaker. That's my thing. I'm not a historian. The last time I took a history class was in my first year of college. I took Russian history. I am a storyteller, and fortunately I chose history, American history, and that's the way a painter might choose to work in oils as opposed to watercolor. And fortunately, history is mostly made up of the word story plus hi, which is a good way to begin a story. So I'm here. I'm still practicing. I'm still practicing. I mean, storytelling is just the editing of human experience. Honey, how was your day? Each film is that, and some of them are tiny, some of them are huge, making decisions that are huge about it relative to our small little niche. But it's great, and then they go out, and each one of those films is a director's cut.
If I said to you, what sets your work apart? What's you have enormous admiration for other documentarians. I know you watch them, you study them, you devour them, you admire them, you worship some of them. What is it that you think if someone said, well, how's Ken Burns different? What's the thing that sets you apart from the way that others go about this art, this craft of yours?
Well, I think in large ways we're unafraid of the word. Our films are in the most part, not all of them, narrated. And that's often a no-no in the purist world of documentary. So we don't think the word and the image are enemies. I think I'm involved in an emotional archaeology. It's not merely excavating the dry dates and facts and events. And I need to qualify that because the word emotional is so completely misunderstood. I do not mean to suggest that they're nostalgic or sentimental. Sentimentality and nostalgia are the enemies of good anything. But there are higher emotions that our founders were interested in creating a circumstance, a government that would work, a machine that would go out of itself, that would permit people to have a lifelong learning. That's what the pursuit of happiness means. It's not about things, it's about learning. And so I'm interested in the emotional archaeology that is a kind of the glue that holds the shards of those dates and facts and events together. And I think we're really disciplined. I think we work really hard. We do deep dives, and we're not using the documentaries to score any contemporary political points. That makes the films, sure, evergreen, but what they also do is invite everyone to the table. Richard Powers, the novelist, said, the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story. I'm just interested in telling a good story, and hopefully that it's told in a way that invites lots of people to the table. Yes, race is central to us. It's inescapable. It's at the heart of our national narrative, and we have to deal with it.
Howard Bryant, who's a sports writer, a very good sports writer, who's in the series, and I saw a quote from him. I don't know if it's in the series, and I missed it, or if this was maybe to a reporter who was reporting about the series. But Howard Bryant said that he thought that it was telling that Muhammad Ali only became beloved in white America when he could no longer talk. I think there's something powerful to that and some truth in it too. So let's just, as I said, we're going to talk about race here. Talk about the way in which you think that race is the central issue in a lot of your filmmaking, and how Ali in a lot of ways is a kind of extension of the work you've been doing on, as we said before, on baseball, on the Civil War, on jazz. It just keeps coming back, this topic, right? Because it's that central to our experience.
I've taken a lot of grief over the course of my professional life because it's always there. If you do anything more than a superficial look at American history, you're gonna bump into the 35 films that you mentioned. Maybe 5, less than the fingers of one hand, don't deal with race overtly. It's just there. I mean, we're born under the idea that all men are created equal, but the guy who wrote that sentence owned hundreds of human beings and didn't see the contradiction. How could it not be at the heart of this story of us, both the U.S. and us, the intimacy of us and the kind of the majesty and the complexity and the contradiction and the controversy of us? And so race is at the heart. It's there everywhere. And, we too often use it as a politically correct addenda to our national narrative, consigned to February, our coldest and shortest month, and not at the, as if it's on the outer orbit of Pluto, and not, at the burning sun, the burning center of our story. it's just there. It's unavoidable, and people have given me so much grief. Friends, even scholars, certainly a lot of people in the press, and by the mid-aughts, people were saying, we're post-racial right now. And then when Barack Obama was elected, they said, now will you stop talking about it? I mean, really good friends. And I held up the Onion magazine, and it said, black man given worst job in nation. I said, just watch what happens.
Yeah.
And, to their credit, most of those people have come back and apologized and said, yes, race is central to us. It's inescapable. It's at the heart of our national narrative, and we have to deal with it.
So you've confronted race at all these different times in the American experience, and you've also made movies over the course of 45 years in the American experience, right? What's different as we sit here in 2021 in terms of both where this story is? I take the historian's eye, and try to look back on this moment 30 years from now, and both how it's being lived and how people react to the way in which we talk about it and consider it. You have kind of a unique vantage on that. Other than the fact that you're white, you're the perfect person to talk about this in a lot of ways.
We're all in this together. There's no divorcing one from the other in these stories. And if you did, then the stories are incomplete. If you feel that you can cover this without dealing with race, then you've got a big problem, much more than my problem of being a white person dealing with it or being given grief by friends and colleagues and critics. Historians are, and I'm an amateur historian, are a kind of a strangely optimistic lot. I don't know why they should be, because they're watching the fact that human nature doesn't change. History doesn't repeat itself. It's just we don't change. And so it seems like it's the same because we react the same way. So there are precedents for all the things that are going on right now. The disturbing part is that these precedents seem to have come from on high, and they seem to have been able to infect and really challenge long-held assumptions and institutions, and that is incredibly worrisome. At the same time, there are precedents. These knuckleheads today look a lot like the know-nothings of the 1830s. The problem is, one of the knuckleheads happened to have lived at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's the terrifying thing.
Yeah.
And so, we're doing a film right now on the U.S., the history of the U.S. and the Holocaust, and it's really about the ways in which the Germans came over and studied our Jim Crow laws to figure out how to do their early exclusionary laws against Jews, and then stuck around for our eugenics, which people like Teddy Roosevelt and Helen Keller loved, and Americans were buying into Henry Ford's Dearborn newspaper that promoted the protocols of the elders of Zion, and we closed the door, the golden door that Emma Lazarus talked about, that's fixed to the Statue of Liberty in 24, and created a quota system in large part to keep out people who were Jewish and who were Catholic and who were coming from places they didn't want them to come from. But the picture of the thousands of Klansmen on the steps of the Capitol, welcomed in the 1920s,
yes,
given the permit to march. This is us, and we have to face it. And I think the best way to do it is by telling stories in our history, because it gives you the kind of triangulation that perspective allows you to have. But these are worrisome times.
Having seen everything you've seen and lived through what we've just lived through in the last 4 years, you said historians, and you are an optimistic lot. Are you optimistic, having gone through what we've just gone through in these last 5 years?
So usually we've been saying for the last 25, 30 years that we need 25 or 30 years distance from a subject to have the perspective necessary to make the kind of non-journalistic judgments. We don't, the first rough draft of history is just that, a rough draft, and you don't turn it in. And so we need to have that process. But time is accelerating so quickly that, maybe you can lower it. I would really like to be able to treat this. I think at least 10 years has to go by. John, that's the toughest question I know. I am an optimist. I've never been so fearful for my country. I remember at 9/11, people crowded into my living room in my little town in New Hampshire. I don't know why. And I just kept pacing the floor, and I said, the idea cannot be killed. The idea cannot be killed. And people have told me I gave courage, and I gave some reassurance to people who were suffering through those events of exactly 20 years ago. And I am fearful for my republic, and I hope that everyone within the sound of my voice will continue to work with the same kind of efforts that they spent on this last election for future elections, as they limit our right to vote, as they limit women's rights to their access to their rights, that we just have to redouble our efforts, because they cannot win. I've seen what it looks like in other countries, and it's not a pretty picture, and we have to escape the specific gravity of that kind of horror. And it only just takes good people, the cliche goes, to look away and absolve themselves of responsibility.
I couldn't be a bigger fan, and it's not just because I love the Muhammad Ali story so much that I'm recommending it. It is a great thing, and if you've never seen it, if you're one of the rare people in America who's never seen anything by Ken Burns, watch the Ali thing, and then you'll be like, okay, I got 40 years worth of stuff to look at now. I'm gonna have to set aside about 6 months to watch it all. But
that's about what it is.
But it's very binge worthy. And Ken Burns, thank you for taking the time again. Everyone, watch the Ali doc on PBS. And be grateful for
Thank
a
you,
guy
John.
like Ken Burns out there doing this kind of work for us all.
The feeling is mutual. I really appreciate this time and this conversation.